Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 26th of November 2017. For those who've studied the big system you're born into, and which is all around you, it's everywhere, it is an actual system, minutely choreographed in a sense by those who give us culture and plan economies, and along with economies come the populations and who the age groups, etc., who's going to work in what, and all of that kind of thing. We're well into a completely scientifically run system. It's not conspiracy. You have governmental departments dealing with the population, the size of population, the age groups, and demographics, all these kind of things to do with running their system. And you hear about it all the time. We need X amount of population for the next generation to pay off the debt and things like that. They're constantly being studied in statistics, etc., to make sure that everything works down the road for those who really run the world, because the people at the bottom don't have really much of a say in anything, really. You've got a bunch of choices in your life, so you think you're free, and your choices really are very limited. In reality, you might have a couple of hundred choices, but you're still limited. You have choices in what kind of shoes you want to wear, or what kind of colour clothing you want to wear, things like that. You have lots of choices, but with important decision making, it's all done at the top, naturally. Because those who run power, just like any corporation, must always ensure that down the road they're still in charge of whatever sector of the economy and sales are involved in. That's how simple it is. I say it's simple, but you have many, many departments all working in the same areas. Plus you have a lot of non-governmental organizations, literally almost private bureaucracies, you might say, who also get work farmed out to them by governments. All governments do that today, and more so than ever, in fact. So we're living in a big scientifically managed system. We've had lots of good movies down through the ages where they show you little glimpses and often in analogy to do with the system you're coming into as you're coming into it. But then also throughout those movies, before you're actually in the system itself that's portrayed in the movie, that was portrayed as sci-fi at the time. For instance, you had Minority Report to do with predictive crime and predictive arrest. So you arrest people before they commit the crime. And because you know they're going to commit the crime, you arrest them before they did it, but regardless, because you know they were definitely going to do it, then you charge them in the same way as though they had done it. That kind of stuff. Well, that's all on the internet too. It's incredibly, minutely observed and monitored. And it's not my guess at this kind of thing. There's so many different agencies, again, privatized agencies working with governments all over the world. Because you're in a global system today. You have a completely global system. And the same agencies can work with many other countries too, using the same techniques for managing their populations in certain areas. We also had Brave New Worlds, an awfully good look at how, for instance, at this present time, those who are considered to be the barbarians, the ones who come from a previous generation, you might say, into the present, how they see the present, and they're called by those in the present a barbarian because your values are old-fashioned, they say. They're out of date, out of sync, and they don't apply anymore. So it's quite easy to see how they call you a barbarian. You're quaint, mind you, you're quaint, and they'll smile and they'll tolerate you, but they can't go along with anything that you say to them. If you say to them, if you carry on like this, you'll be extinct. And things like that, it doesn't make any difference. They'll laugh at you. And we're pretty well there, aren't we? We're living in a system where even an article I was reading from one of the government institutions recently mentioned about, they always say about live births, because now with so many abortions, they always put down X amount of live births because there's so many who never get to get born because of abortion. So many of them, and who knows, some folks say it's over half, well over half, in many countries are actually aborted. And then they tell you there's not enough people. And they're constantly doing surveys too to see if, because they don't really want those in those countries to actually have children. They want to use it as an excuse to bring other folk into those countries, because you're living in a completely different system, an international system today. And so it must be made to be international. So you must eradicate the old populations in a sense, or let them die off at least. This is old stuff. This is stuff that H.G. Wells talked about at the beginning of the 20th century. And he worked for the Fabian Society and a few other societies. And the Fabian Society was just the left-wing organization to manage the working class people under the pretext that they were there to help them. But in reality, it was to bring in the socialized, managed, expertly run society that the so-called right-wing wanted anyway. And then that's how they worked it out to be. And we're in it today. We're in it today where we're so well managed. And most folk don't know that they're even managed. Some countries do, more so. Some countries do. Where they've used them as test beds for experimentation in the social new norms, basically. As I've mentioned, GIRFEC in Scotland, where every child who is born gets a government kind of appointee, guardian type appointed to them, who has access to the homes and everything else, all the children, to make sure that they grow up with the right indoctrination and the right indoctrinated ideas and the right indoctrinated opinions. What a tremendous experiment, eh? More so tremendous that the people actually allow it to happen. Quite some. But don't forget that Scotland's SNP is a complete international socialist run system under the guise of a nation, the Scottish National Party. What a joke. It was always to be international. Always. You can't have them both, can you? But what an experiment. I'll touch on that tonight too. But the main point tonight is just, and it really is a spur-of-the-moment thing for me, is to show how you're living through this amazing, well-planned script. And again, I keep using the same examples. Go into the statements about foundations, for instance. Foundations are set up by an international elite of multi-billionaires, now it's trillionaires actually, and they have massive funding. They're tax-free foundations, and they employ multi-thousands of non-governmental organizations as armies that go out and lobby on their behalf and do many other things too. They also own most of the think tanks across the planet. And they advise governments as to what to do. When I say advise, they tell governments what to do, and the politicians know it. The ones at the very, very top are international. Every other organization is a subcategory of the same one at the top. And I've gone into the history of that many times as well. Again, no conspiracy theories. It's in their own words, in their own records too, what their goals always were. And that's what Aldous Huxley talked about in his interviews with Mike Wallace. He said that his biggest fear for his class, his own class, and when you say class, he saw himself as part of an intelligentsia, scientific class. His brother, Julian Huxley, had said that at the very top you have the economic giants. Beneath them, you have the scientific class that runs it all beneath them, including the behaviorists and scientists who deal with the minds and the masses. These were the ones who were the specialist class who dealt with that. Then you had teachers and academia, etc., all the way down to the bottom. So many classes, and Aldous Huxley talked about being in the scientific class. And he said that at that time, in interviews with Mike Wallace, he said overpopulation was their biggest worry at the time. Now, when you go into Julian Huxley and read his writings from the late 1800s onwards, he was obsessed on behalf of his class with the wrong people being born. They were really into genetics. Long before Adolf Hitler came along, they were into genetics and eugenics and the right kind of genes and the wrong kind of genes, and so on and so on and so on. And they really didn't make any differentiation between the peasant class of say, Britain and the peasant class in any other country. That's what's so interesting about it. People at the bottom especially are given a form of nationalism. because it was always good to have the idea of nationhood within you. There's a natural instinct too. You love the country you're on, even the soil you're on. It's almost in your genes, but it's abused, and then they use that against you as they send you off to countless wars, and it thins out the population, and they're quite blatant about it. That's one aspect of it too. And they have less trouble at home, as they say. They say that many revolutions are caused by overpopulation. This is what they're taught amongst their classes at the top. And so they can do away with internal revolutions if you keep a safety valve off by simply exporting them to other countries, like Australia, Canada, and so on, or having wars, or both. But the wrong kind of people, as they keep saying, the wrong kind of people were getting born, and they wanted to do something about it. Aldous Huxley said, scientific techniques have been developed which could induce people to accept a system or systems which they ought not, meaning in their better interest, they ought not to accept. Techniques that would be used upon them, which they would be oblivious of, but which would act upon them, you see. And we have all that today. In his writings, he talked about the radio and so on, different techniques, and indoctrination through school, but you add on to that the television, the greatest weapon of all, actually. And then the computer. And you definitely get, especially when you standardize information across the board, you definitely will have standardized people all getting the same information, all with the same opinions, because it's all given to them scientifically. Until it becomes, their opinions that are given to them are done so well, they don't realize they've been given those opinions, but they will start parroting them without reasoning them through. Well understood way back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and so on. And don't forget that Brave New World by Huxley was written about 1932 and 1933, and he was dead on with the techniques that would be used. Free love, etc., which wasn't new, because long before him, you find H.G. Wells had been promoting that in the late 1800s. There was a free love society run by the same multi-billionaires at the top. They funded it, they asked their families, etc. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, because you'll still have it today. If you even brought this up, these topics up I'm going to touch on tonight, you'll have people who say, well, what's wrong with that? Isn't it better to have a uniform peace across the board than occasional upstart causing trouble? And what it's about is the right to be an individual versus the system or society's right to manage everyone into a uniform, standardized system. A collectivist type mentality and system. And even bringing that up, you'd have very heated debates before you knew it. And lots of people that you'll know will take the opinion that, yeah, well, it's right that people should be made to believe and do and etc. Made for the peace and the good of all. And there's a common theme that comes out. And it's exactly the same as those at the very top who do control the system. Have debated long ago, and they have chosen the fact that the system that they would make sure was going to be in place is the present system of mass surveillance. The predictive abilities of computerized systems to understand exactly every individual and where they're going to go in the near future, down the road, etc., by the data collection. And we're pretty well in it today. So nothing, as I say, nothing that happens outside some asteroid flying in through that they never saw coming, nothing that happens in your lifetime wasn't planned. Everything is planned that way. And one foundation, or a private corporation can work out 100 years into the future where they want to be. That's how they work it. And I've said they could hire and retire different generations along the way until they achieve their objective. There's nothing difficult about it. If you have a motto, and here's their motto, this is where you're going to be in 150 years' time, and every group that's brought in on board to work there and retire there lives to that motto, they can make it happen. That's how things are done. The average Joe can't imagine that, because we are short-term planners generally. We don't have that ability in our little lives, with limited income and all the rest of it, we don't have that ability to plan to such incredible depth. Our futures is not so easy. In fact, we're subject to the rises and falls of stock markets and crashes and all the rest of the stuff that comes upon us. It's all out of our hands. So to show you how we're into the socialized system, now the elite want socialism to manage the people. Socialism, communism, doesn't matter what you want to call it, it's the same thing. It's a collective society where eventually, step by step, you're brought into a collectivist system. You'll be dished out money by the government, and whether you're working or not, and you got to spend it, or else you can't. It won't be saved up. That was Bertrand Russell. I've gone through that before, many times before, where he wrote about that in his books. That was a big plan. Now let's go before he came along. At least in any known sense of the word. We have H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells is quite an amazing character because he was really out there in the late 1800s, as I say, involved in this free love movement and all the rest of it too. To break the standard mores, meaning the family unit, that was imperative. On behalf of a ruling elite, H.G. Wells was no communist. Even the group that he helped found, along with George Bernard Shaw, the Fabian Society, was no communist society, even though they worked deeply with the communists. They even boasted how close they were with communism, as they had a place at the table in the Soviet Union. That's how they phrased it. But the people who belonged to it in the UK were wealthy people. And the workers of it who wanted to be wealthy, the H.G. Wellses and so on. And I've put up the links before where George Bernard Shaw says, when we are in power, you'll have to come to us to justify why we should allow you to stay alive. They wouldn't have any dead weight. They wouldn't have anybody who was sick, chronically and so on. They'd have to just be eliminated. Long before Adolf Hitler came along, don't forget that. Now, Wells wrote in 1902 about faith and morals and public policy. And he says, under a scientific analysis, the essential facts of life are very clearly shown to be two: birth and death. And the ethical system of these men of the New Republic, he called it the New Republic, they bring in, the ethical system which will dominate the world state will be shaped primarily to favor the procreation of what is fine and efficient and beautiful in humanity. Beautiful and strong bodies, clear and powerful minds, and a growing body of knowledge, and to check the procreation of base and servile types, of fear-driven and cowardly souls, of all that is mean and ugly and bestial in the souls, bodies, or habits of men. To do the latter is to do the former. The two things are inseparable. And the method that nature has followed hitherto in the shaping of the world, whereby weakness was prevented from propagating weakness, and cowardice and feebleness were saved from the accomplishment of their desires, the method that has only one alternative, the method that must in some cases still be called in to the help of man, is death. In other words, kill off the feeble, etc., etc. He's talking about. 1902. And the new vision, death is no inexplicable horror. Remember, that's what they also had in Brave New World, where they teach the children that death is wonderful. It's no horror, no pointless terminal terror to the miseries of life. It is the end of all the pain of life, the end of the bitterness of failure, because all the people at the bottom, you'll feel you're a failure, and so on. The merciful obliteration of weak and silly and pointless things. He also talked about the breeding of people and breeding the right kind of people. And you find that Russell talked about all these characters were all in the same clubs, remember. The new ethics will hold life to be a privilege, and there you go, and a responsibility. And the alternative and right conduct between living fully, beautifully, and efficiently will be to die. For a multitude of contemptible and silly creatures, fear-driven and helpless and useless, unhappy or hateful, happy in the midst of squalor, dishonor, feeble, ugly, inefficient, born of unrestrained lusts, and increasing and multiplying through sheer incontinence and stupidity, the men of the New Republic will have little pity and less benevolence. To make life convenient for the breeding of such people will seem to them not the most virtuous and amiable thing in the world, as it is held to be now. Because he's talking about the charities that should be held in contempt. But an exceedingly abominable proceeding. Procreation is an unavoidable thing for sane persons of even the most furious passions, and the men of the New Republic will hold that the procreation of children who, by the circumstances of their parentage, must be diseased bodily or mentally, do not think it will be difficult for the medical science of the coming time to define such circumstances is absolutely the most loathsome of all conceivable sins. They will hold that a certain portion of the population, a small minority, for example, afflicted with indisputably transmissible diseases, with transmissible mental disorders, with such hideous incurable habits of mind as a craving for intoxication, exists only on sufferance, out of pity and patience, and on the understanding that they do not propagate, and I do not foresee any reason to suppose that they will hesitate to kill when that sufferance is abused. So he's talking about killing off alcoholics and all kinds of people that they didn't agree with. And then he says, the men of the New Republic will not be squeamish either in facing or inflicting death, because they will have a fuller sense of possibilities of life than we possess. They will have an ideal that will make killing worth the while. Like Abraham, they will have the faith to kill, and they will have no superstitions about death. They will naturally regard the modest suicide of incurably melancholy or disease or helpless persons as a high and courageous act of duty rather than a crime. And since they will regard, as indeed all men raised above a brutish level do regard, a very long term of imprisonment as infinitely worse than death, as being indeed the death with a living misery added to its natural terror, they will, I conceive, where the whole tenor of a man's actions, and not simply some indecent or impulsive action, seems to prove him unfitting for free life in the world, consider him carefully and condemn him and remove him from being. All such killing will be done with an opiate, for death is too grave a thing to be made painful or dreadful, and used as a deterrent from crime. To kill under the seemly conditions science will afford is a far less offensive thing. The rulers of the future will grudge making good people into jailers, warders, punishment dealers, nurses, attendants on the bad. People who cannot live happily and freely in the world without spoiling the lives of others are better out of it. That is a current sentiment even today, but the men of the New Republic will have the courage of their opinions. And he goes on too about sterilization, sterile sex, and so on, which is awfully interesting because we're here today. You don't think these things just came and disappeared. They're still here, the same organizations running all. Some of them change their names, some don't. As is the essential aspect of all this wild and windy business of the sexual relations is, after all, births. That's all they cared about, was the birth aspect of it. Upon this plain fact, the people of the emergent New Republic will unhesitatingly go. The preeminent value of sexual questions in morality lies in the fact that the lives of which we will constitute the future are involved. If they are not involved, if we can disassociate this relationship from this issue, then sexual questions become of no more importance than the morality of one's deportment at chess or the general morality of outdoor games. Indeed, when the question of sexual relationships would be entirely on all fours with, and probably very analogous to the question of golf, in each question it would be for the medical man and the psychologist to decide how far the thing was wholesome and permissible, and how far it was an aggressive bad habit and an absorbing waste of time and energy. In other words, a specialist will decide what's right and wrong. An able-bodied man continually addicted to lovemaking that had no result in offspring would be just as silly and morally objectionable as an able-bodied man who devoted his chief energies to hitting little balls all over golf links. But no more. Both would probably be wasting the lives of other human beings. The golfer must employ his caddy. It's entirely the matter of births, and a further consideration to be presently discussed that makes this analogy untrue. It does not, however, make it so untrue as to do away with the probability that in many cases the emergent men of the new time will consider sterile gratification, that's sex without offspring, sterile gratification a moral and legitimate thing. And it is today. Naturally, now it's been made a recreational thing. St. Paul tells us it is better to marry than to burn, but to beget children on that account will appear, I imagine, to these coming men as an absolutely loathsome proceeding. Most of the human types that by civilized standards are undesirable are quite willing to die out through such suppressions if the world will only encourage them a little. They multiply in sheer ignorance, but they do not desire multiplication even now, and they can easily be made to dread it. Sensuality aims not at life, but at itself. I believe that the men of the new republic will deliberately shape their public policy along these lines. Well, it's already been done. The big movement in the 50s and even in the 40s by certain schools was to separate the bonding instinct from mating, from the sexual mating of the male and female. If you would separate the bonding part from it, then you'd end up with a recreational system. And that's what it is today. It's promoted through everything you look at, for goodness sake, just rut like rabbits, and that's it. That's supposed to be the healthiest thing you could possibly do. And any offspring that does come out of it is just mass abortion across the place. We take that as quite normal. There's nothing I'm reading that hasn't been done. But I'm reading from a time when it was still in the planning, and it was still in the early phases of putting it into operation. And then they go on to talk about the development of science has lifted famine and pestilence from the shoulders of man, and it will yet lift war for some other end than to give him a spell of promiscuous and finally cruel and horrible reproduction. No doubt the sentimentalist and all whose moral sense has been vigorously trained in the old school find this rather a dreadful suggestion. It amounts to saying that for the abyss to become a hotbed of sterile immorality will fall in with the deliberate policy of the ruling class in the days to come. At any rate, will be terminating evil. At present, the abyss is a hotbed, breeding undesirable and too often fearfully miserable children under the really very horrible morality of today. The spectacle of a mean-spirited, undersized, diseased little man, quite incapable of earning a decent living, even for himself, married to some underfed, ignorant, ill-shaped, plain and diseased little woman, and guilty of the lives of 10 or 12 ugly, ailing children, is regarded as extremely edifying spectacle. And so on. He really didn't like the working classes at all. Actually, they terrified him in case he ever had to be forced to join them. But this is what they put forward, remember, on behalf of the working class to get them on board with their own demise. You see how cleverly it's all done? He talks about the inferior races, and he says, how will it be to treat the inferior races? Certainly not as races at all. It will aim to establish, and it will at least, though probably only after a second century has passed, establish a world state with a common language and common rule. All over the world, its roads, its standards, its laws, and its apparatus of control will run. It will, I have said, make the multiplication of those who fall behind a certain standard of social efficiency unpleasant and difficult, and it will have cast aside any coddling laws to save adult men from themselves. It will tolerate no dark corners where the people of the abyss may fester. No vast diffused slums of peasants, proprietors, no stagnant plague preserves, and for the rest those swarms of black and brown and dirty white and yellow people who do not come into the new needs of efficiency. Well, the world is a world, not a charitable institution, and I take it they will have to go. The whole tenor and meaning of the world as I see it is that they have to go so far as they fail to develop sane, vigorous and distinctive personalities for the great world of the future. It is their portion to die out and disappear. Now remember too, he also wrote about the future. This is part of the future, but not the same book. And in other books he talks about, he talks about too, they would use sea power again to waste your tax money to provide electricity, and which is happening against more stories in the paper this week you can find about that. And also, they would use more and more solar power and windmills and so on to create this. This is 100 odd years ago. just to show you're following the big plan. Interestingly, too, he talks about the creation of a world government before the League of Nations was up and running, because he was part of the group as a propagandist for the group who was behind it all. And he talked about the ability for bureaucrats in one nation to bypass their own elected governments and go straight to their brothers in another governmental country in a system and talk with them, get things done, just bypass the politics altogether. That was the whole point of it. Still is with the United Nations. Now, you can imagine too who it would be if the UN had got all the things it wanted to go, get done. And they would have, we'd be living in this, what I've just read here right now, in fact. Many people are so jaded with politics that they say, what's wrong with that? At least to get things done. But and it's so easy to fall in that trap, isn't it? You stop and wait a minute and think, wait a minute. And in that case, there's no representation for the public at all, even though what we have at the moment is a kind of a bit of a sham. At least it's something. But you won't even have the sham eventually. You'll just have a faceless bureaucrats and 1,000 million forms they fill in to get anything answered, and even you'll never get any answer. That's the alternative. But that's what the big boys at the top want. They've always wanted that, where experts, they'll rule the world on behalf of the financial elite. And we're pretty well there, actually, especially when they bring forth the supposed, we're told, the great philanthropists, and they're not even inventors. They simply own the new formats of cars and things that have to get pushed ahead. And they're businessmen and investors who get governments to back them dollar for dollar, or actually more, on their investments, so they can't fail. This is the new form of ruling the world. We don't vote them in. We don't vote in to use the equipment that's produced by their factories, but their government's rubber stamping it. Can you imagine the power when you can get the government to rubber stamp that every citizen must use your particular, whatever it happens to be? That's quite the power, isn't it? And folk don't even seem to notice that. But it's not new. It's the same thing with vaccines and various other things too. And as in fact, the pharmacology would love to have the government mandate we all take pills. Eventually that will come with Soma. And it's coming anyway initially with medical marijuana, because now it's a time to keep folk tranquil as to go through the massive changes into the next part of the new system. Now, I've touched on before the system of social approval and disapproval. I've been given lots of talks in the past about these techniques dreamed up by the social engineers and behaviorism. And neuroscience, of course, is all on board with it. Everybody's on board with it to do with managing your mind. But behaviorism is a big technique now of managing all citizens without their even knowing that they're being manipulated. Everyone wants to get along with everyone else. We all have that image of ourselves. We want to be liked by other people. It's really drummed into today in school, social approval and disapproval, groupthink, going along with the group. Don't be the oddball that's got a different opinion. Today is taboo in this day and age. And it continues. This training continues throughout your life. We've had the recent admissions by social media of censoring people who have different or taboo topics or opinions or whatever, anything that's politically incorrect at the moment. And they tell you quite openly what is correct and what's politically incorrect, and what they want, what they don't want. So you're left to be blackmailed actually to go along with the system to be accepted. Well, in some countries, and I've given talks even years ago about China being set up as the model state by the United Nations that we're all supposed to follow. Now, China is a vastly different culture than other cultures, and it's a collectivist type culture, more so than Western civilizations, who are more independent, more individualistic in how we get along and how we live our lives. But we're not going to be allowed that. If anything, you'll be eradicated if you don't go along with this, because the big global agenda is for collectivism, in a sense. Until we're almost clones of each other, with all the same opinions, we all want to be good. We want to be socially approved as good, and that way we can get our monthly pay from the government and so on, because that's where it's all supposed to go. As Bertrand Russell said years ago, the state will issue you your cash every month, where you work or not. And that's even been in the news recently again. I read it 2 or 3 weeks ago. Same thing, where they were considering giving everybody a basic income, where you worked or not. You're simply living a script. A script is over 100 years old, at least. And social approval and social disapproval. Well, here's China. It says good citizens will get fast internet and other benefits. And this is from Hired China, so it's actually for jobs in China. And fine, if that's what they want. If that's what they want, they can do what they want. Sure they can. But to force this system on the West, it could cause some problems, I think. Maybe not. Because the techniques I do not ever downplay on the West. I've watched people having their opinions changed all the time by the techniques that are used in science. This is by 2020, the behavior of every single citizen and legal person, which includes every company or other entity in China, will be rated and ranked participating in China's credit scores. The credit scores will be mandatory. This was published in 2014. The State Council of China published a document called Planning Outline for the Construction of a Social Credit System. In 3 short years, based on the government's plan, Chinese tech giants WeChat and Alipay have already launched their own credit scoring system. National Trust Scoring System exists now to rate people in China and secure them services based on the social credit score. And they have other citizens. This is, you actually see it's already here, but you don't call it the same names. But basically, these other citizens, it could even be sock puppets, giving you scores on how good you are or bad you are, whatever it happens to be. A national database will merge a wide variety of information on everyone, assessing whether taxes and traffic tickets have been paid, whether academic degrees have been rightly earned, etc. Tencent, and developer of the messaging app WeChat with more than 850 million active users, launched its own credit system early August, signaling that private social credit systems are alive and well. They mentioned the same thing about Alipay, etc. And it says, no one understands you more than data giants. Controversially, data giants do not hide that it judges the types of products shoppers buy online. Someone who plays video games for 10 hours a day, for example, would be considered an idle person. To tie that right in to what I mentioned earlier from H.G. Wells from 100 years ago. Someone who frequently buys diapers would be considered as probably a parent who on balance is more likely to have a sense of responsibility. Another category to assess credit is interpersonal relationships. Sharing what Sesame Credit refers to as positive energy online, nice messages about the government and how well the country's economy is doing will make your score go up. You can see where it all is meant to go. And Sesame has promoted the consumer benefits of a good credit score, from a prominent dating profile on the Baha'i matchmaking site to VIP reservations with hotels and car rental companies. The social credit system in China also affects foreign business. While many reports have focused on how social scoring will affect individuals, a more interesting aspect might be its implications for doing business in China, including foreign companies. Actually, that's not a bad idea for scoring for rating the businesses, because some of these businesses are really ripping off their customers. Anyway, functionally speaking, the data will be collected from multiple sources by the so-called National Credit Information Sharing Platform. Do you understand the power that's in the hands of government with all of this? And used to generate ratings for each company. And people with low ratings will have slower internet speeds. That's what they're going to give you as punishment. And restricted access to restaurants and the removal of the right to travel. So you better be good. You better say all the right things and praise everything in the system and so on. That's where it's all going to go. Remember, this is the model state for the world to follow, according to the United Nations. And people with low ratings have slower internet speeds, restricted access to certain restaurants, nightclubs, and so on, removal of a right to travel freely abroad with restrictive control and consumption within holiday areas or travel businesses, will not be hired by certain employers and will be forbidden from obtaining some jobs. And that's what you have in this is still a single-party system in China. And again, folk think nothing of it, do they? It's quite interesting to see all this. China has social credit. Beijing sets up a huge system. That was BBC, also on the same topic. And in most countries, the existence of a credit system isn't controversial. Past financial information is used to protect when individuals will pay their mortgages and so on, blah, blah, blah. But China has taken the whole concept a few steps further. The government is building an omnipotent social credit system that's meant to rate each citizen's trustworthiness. There you go. It's interesting, though. I mean, I think some topics are too frightening for most folk to even take it seriously. It's, they could never do that, or they wouldn't do that, etc., etc. But that's exactly what they are doing. That's exactly what they're doing. And as I say, that's the model state for the world. Jack Zatali mentioned it in one of his books as well, that you would be given slower internet speed and you would be censored if you had any opinions that weren't in line with the... Now, look at the power, though. Being critical of government or any government policy could have you unemployed and living in poverty and maybe starving to death, just because you didn't agree with something that government was doing at the time. That's total power. That's what it's called, totalitarianism, isn't it? But no country is going to object to this. None of your governments are going to object to this because they want to bring it in across the board, across the world. And as I say, that kind of system might work fine in a country that is very collectivist by its own historical culture, history, and so on. But it wouldn't wash in the West so well, would it? Or maybe it would, I don't know. I think with enough indoctrination of the right kind, anything can be done to society. I've witnessed it too much of it in my own lifetime. That's been done, that was written about again, often before I was born, by big players in this future planning industry. And it's all come to pass, so nothing really shocks me, in a sense. I can't see why they can't bring it in, especially if they get a culture in the West that's addicted to leisure or addicted to playing on the internet or whatever the particular thing it is. I think they could use that as a bargaining tool, be good, etc., and accept this and this and this and this, go along with all of these things and will allow you to keep playing yourself. I mean, I think that's literally how they could do it. Play itself will be of tremendous value in this bargaining that may or may not even go on. But there you go, that's that. And once taboo socialism, communism, finds comrades amongst US millennials, all falls into place if you're wondering why it's all happening now. Nothing happens by itself. It's all coerced and managed to bring all things together at the right time for particular agendas. And it says Lee Carter, who this week won a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates, is part of a growing cadre of young politicians pledging their allegiance to the Democratic Socialists of America. And they're quite blatant about it with their little hammers and sickles and all the rest of it too. What they mean by this is quite... And what's amazing, really, is the fact that most folk have access to the same information that I have and you all have, but most folk don't look it up and find out why is all the top international corporations, the so-called capitalists, on board with forcing a form of socialism across the world on the masses of the public? It's always been that way, though. From even before Lenin came along. It was always the elite behind all this kind of stuff. And a managed society, as H.G. Wells talked about, would make it much, much easier for the elite to rule the world by planning who gets born, who doesn't get born, who they can eliminate, etc., etc. Make it much easier for them to manage it all. Now, talking about the mass indoctrination and so on. Now, Scotland is a test base for GIRFEC. I've mentioned that before. Getting it right for every child is supposedly called. There are a few names for it now too, and things added on to it under the so-called wellness program. This farce of wellness. For the new system, you understand, once you're in a collectivist society and you're given the bare minimum to live on every week across the board, basically, then you're in a collectivist society where the state's in control of dishing out the cash for everybody, whether you're working or not. A centralized system. That was what communism was, of course. And technically the state was in charge of everything, but even in the communist system it wasn't. The state didn't own all the means of production because many corporations worked in hand in glove with the corporation, the actual corporation of the government, that is. All governments are corporations. And so it was a bit of a farce. And plus they did have private banking systems over there too for the elite that ruled the Soviet system. It had the little caveat that it was allowed if you did make profits off the back of labourers. Not kidding you. Well, I can imagine how lawyers would run rings around that, and they certainly did. But anyway, Scotland is a test bed for all of this stuff. It's got wellness. Now, what a wellness? I did talks on that years ago when I saw this creeping into how's your wellness? And they did surveys, you see. Well, people could be awfully poor, but their feeling of well-being was just hunky-dory. Well, you could drug folk and starve them to death at the same time, and they'll tell you as they're starving to death, they're feeling just hunky-dory. Their wellness is fine. And I'm not just joking about this. You think about they're going to bring in a lot of different drugs now, legalize a lot of different drugs, make it cheap, to bring you through this big phase of the big change into the system, the new system. And if you got you drugged on some kind of Soma, then all the better. Doesn't matter what it is, as long as you can just drop out. Oh, and be all happy. How are you feeling today? Well, I have no job, but they gave me this £0.5 of so-and-so, and it's gave me quite a buzz here. I feel pretty well. Well, that's where they're going with all this stuff. I'm not kidding you. H.G. Wells talked about all the useless eaters, like Bertrand Russell did the same thing, same organizations. Yeah. Be humane, kill them off humanely. So here's this thing to do with GIRFEC. This is Postcards from the Fringe. At Times Trust and Scottish Home Education Forum held a fringe evidence session Wednesday, 15th November 2017 to gather views on the Children and Young People Information Sharing Scotland Bill, which is currently before the Education and Skills Committee of the Scottish Parliament. We heard evidence from those with first-hand experience of GIRFEC, that's getting it right for every child. That's where every child is given basically allocated a named person by the government at birth, who will check into them all the time throughout their lives, basically, to make sure that they're politically correct, etc., as far as I can see. Then they give the Shanari, is another thing here, Shanari, a name persons policy. So it's GIRFEC, Shanari, a name person policy. The parents and families on the receiving end of practitioners' well-being subjectivity. You can tell you're in a socialist country with all these terms. Despite the fact that Parliament didn't think it necessary to seek the views of and hear from such vital players in this debate, the evidence from parents and families is nevertheless crucial to deliberations over this legislation, because it is they who have and will continue to bear the brutal brunt of such ill-conceived, poorly drafted legislation. The legislation is totalitarian in its whole concept. What we heard further highlighted the appalling experiences of families under this much-hated scheme, with families making it clear they do not want this legislation in any form. They want it scrapped in totality. Parents and families were keen to start a petition calling for a public inquiry on the whole debacle, and if Parliament will not do this, families want an independent citizens' inquiry in order to get at the truth. Parents and families do not only want the named person scheme scrapped, they raise questions over the viability of continuing with GIRFEC. As one parent stated, data is the spine of GIRFEC. It's not about data collection, but everybody in the family. I mean, completely intimate, ongoing throughout their entire life. Because they also have the GIRFEC for every adult now too, they're pushing to try to push through. So how can it work given the ruling from the UK Supreme Court last year? Some of those who gave evidence accompanied us down to the Parliament at the end of the evidence sessions, and one young person who has been a victim of legislation presented James Dornan, member of Scottish Parliament, convener of the Education and Skills Committee, with over 90 pieces of evidence of families' experiences. We hope Mr. Dornan and every member of the committee read and hear these experiences. It's a massive experiment, and it's much bigger than... And they want the Scottish Parliament ain't going to tell the people that it's above even them. They're all working in concert with a much higher organisation, global, and Scotland is a test bed for all of this social engineering and all the damage. You see, understand, if you're working class and all the rest, you're just written off. You're completely written off as part of the experiment. Just like test rats. Rats in laboratories, once they've had all the tests they've done on them, they're always killed by law. I'm not kidding you. And then they're dissected. That's what they do with them. They don't keep them alive if they survive different injections of disease or whatever. They literally kill them. And with all this incredible meddling in people's brains and their minds and in their family life and their personal everyday living, they don't give a darn the damage it causes to people. They really don't. Another one too, getting it right for every child. GIRFEC, I'll put this up to this link so you can read it for yourself. Remember, this is a test for the world. You'll all get this. It would fall in right in with China. I'm sure they have a system in different systems in China. Was even better, tweaked, you might say, for total engineering of every citizen as they're growing up. This is GIRFEC's a national approach in Scotland to improving outcomes and supporting the well-being of our children. Well-being is a very broad thing. It could mean anything you want. Of our children and young people by offering the right help at the right time from the right people. It supports them and their parents to work in partnership. Well, the parents didn't ask for anybody to work in partnership. You understand? Parents are supposed to be parents, but again, they're telling you, no, you're not anymore. All children are ours. That's what the state is telling you. That's what Bertrand Russell said. He said, we used to think, we, meaning the Socialist International, he was a Lord, remember, part of the right-wing group at the top, who ran the left wing, and he talked about them. He said, we should think we'd have to take all the children off their parents at birth and raise them independently so they weren't contaminated with the views and opinions of their parents. He says, but now we realize, but by the right indoctrination, if we get the children young enough, even in the kindergarten phase, we can so indoctrinate them scientifically that any parental input will be null and void. It will be of no consequence. It'll be so perfect, you see. Here you are. It's all here. It's all here, folks. So it's quite an article. I'll put these up for you to read. And then you've got from the government too, another one too on the same topic from the government. But this one here is a brief introduction to GIRFEC, Shanari, and My World. GIRFEC. They're all well-being indicators necessary for a child, young person to reach their potential, blah, 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 blah. And the My World Triangle is a pictorial representation of assessment tool used with individual children to determine which of their needs are being met. Now, who decides what their needs are? Well, the state will, of course. And it's also with emotional and everything else needs, including if they want to change anything, they can do that as well. And one thought on a brief introduction to GIRFEC, Shanari, and My World too. It's got links going into the government, etc., etc. Quite amazing, eh? All this stuff that we'd read our whole life, well, I read them whole lives, and you're living through the phase of it all being implemented. It's quite amazing, isn't it? And so blatantly too. If you'd mentioned that again 40 years ago, folk would laugh at all that. They could never do that. Their parents would never let it happen. Well, look at it today. Russell too said back in the 50s, he says, we're training a generation to only listen to experts, and they won't be able to do anything by themselves unless an expert tells them how, including changing, he said it, the nappy at the time was Britain, it was called a nappy, it's a diaper, on their own children, which at that time seemed ludicrous because everybody knew how to do that. But now they don't. They've been trained never to believe their own instincts and abilities. You must get an opinion of the television as some expert brought on how to do this or that, or simple things. So there you go. It's all there, isn't it? It's all there. And then again, too, television was awfully successful in separating the parents from the children, even the men from the women. I mean, everybody for a long time had their own TV set in their own different rooms. Quite some of the way it's been worked out very efficiently. Now, I've mentioned too that for the last few years, it was like a switch had been pulled on all the press, and suddenly you're not getting real news anymore. It's all nonsense and junk and basically baseless stories when you look into things. That's the new normal for us all across the board. I went into the Levinson inquiry in Britain, and the one they had in Australia too, and across other British Commonwealth countries. And all these things went into force at the same time. And this article was from 2013, and it's about, the push to control all the press. Because Harman warns of full-on laws to control press if papers do not sign up to Royal Charter. And it says the Culture Secretary Maria Miller told members of Parliament that papers cannot be forced to sign. Then it threatens them all if they don't go along with it and sign on to this new watchdog of watching what they say and so on and so on. See, that's how it all started with the inquiries in Britain and London. And they talk about the Culture Secretary. I've mentioned before, everybody's got a Culture Secretary and a Culture Department and so on. It's quite interesting, isn't it? As they change your culture, they still have a Culture Department, which is there to make sure that you're adapting to the new changes in culture. Quite amazing, eh? And they're going to police it and fine people and force folk out that won't go along with it. Also, in the US, they've just struck down a bill, some old law that's been working up to the present time to stop monopolies, real bigger monopolies of media concentration. Now they're allowing them to basically have corporations that own maybe a half or more of all of your media and outlets too. That's in the press now too. Because now it's time, you see, to go into the one world system and into the new controlling organization that controls the world. That's what it's all about, global. And lots of folk will go along with it thinking, well, what's wrong with it? If we can play with our lives and be good and do all the right things we're told to do, and perpetual childhood is what it is. And maybe some folk can, actually a lot of folk probably can. They probably will love socialism, as long as they get careful nudges before they get hammered to get them back into line if they're going off on the wrong track without knowing it. They might just enjoy it. Sad but true, perpetual childhood in a world run by experts and a tier above it all. It's almost like getting above the clouds where the real world is, the real world where you know everything is being done, you're part of doing it all. But below the cloud we have the ordinary people across the planet who are kept in a scientific maze, basically. That's sad, isn't it? But that's the way it really is. For me, it's always been evident that they use galvanizing techniques to force us into the next system, and the next system has to be done in such a way, in a crisis situation, you might say, to get us into it. Thinking we're just, actually we must always be taught that they're helping us as we get plundered. Because the next step is to bring in, as I say, the governmental minimum pay thing across the board, whether you're working or not. In a service economy, they know that we're going down the tubes. It's meant to go down the tubes. They knew that before they brought it in. And you could do books and books and books on that alone. It's just too easy. But anyway, the European Central Bank wants to end deposit protection, I've talked about this before, and offer savers appropriate amount of their own money. This is from the Central Bank. The World Bank's in on it too, and IMF and all the rest of it. Anyway, covered deposits no longer need to be protected, according to the European Central Bank, which was proposed this month to stop withdrawals when a bank is on the verge of failing. Covered deposits and claims under investor compensation schemes should be replaced by limited discretionary exemptions to be granted by the competent authority, I like that part, the competent authority, which is themselves, in order to retain a degree of flexibility to the bank's proposal. And so the current €100,000 deposit level currently protected in the event of a bail-in would no longer be available. So a bail-in, remember, is when a bail-out is when the government uses your tax money to bail them out. A bail-in is when they grab your savings. But supposedly you were insured up to €100,000. So during a transitional period, depositors should have access to an appropriate amount of their covered deposits to cover the cost of living, as if there's a crash, within 5 working days of a request. So you have to put a request in to get money out if their bank crashes. That means depositors will have to wait 5 days for a competent authority, quotation marks, to decide what is an appropriate amount of their own money, your money, that they might give to you. So you can buy food, pay bills, and so on. Now, this is happening now, folks, for those who haven't quite got it. That this is mainstream stuff too. It's not conspiracy nonsense. And it makes sense to me. That's where they'd want to go to bring in the new crisis system. It would have to be done in a form of crisis. And we're producing nothing. We're a service economy, and we can only paddle for so long. But I'll put these links up for those who care to paddle through it. Don't let it get you down, by the way, because let's be honest, I think we've always been run by crisis. And whole generations that were run in the past with their own forms, not quite as efficient, of social engineering and you might say, diversions off the mind. But today we're into an awfully good, all-encompassing form of it for sure. Anyway, from myself, Alan Watt from Ontario, Canada, it's good night to me, your God or your gods go with you.